How you doing, everybody? This is Jon Croft with Cultural Warfare with Jon Croft, and I am Jon Croft. How's everybody doing? We're live on our show on YouTube for the first time. We did not practice this at all, so this is just us pushing the button and going, "Okay, let's start."
It's
Uh,
off
it,
the cuff.
it's off the cuff, and um, and we've got our tea, and I've got a Zoom going at the same time, and I've got my other camera going at the same time. But I could not do X while I'm doing all this. So I just said, sorry, X, we're gonna do this another time. Yeah, so culture warfare, we got episode 59. And have you had any media experiences this week, Rebecca?
Yes, well, I have. I was going to talk about, I hope this isn't yours, but I was going to talk
Oh,
about Francis Schaeffer.
oh yes.
So we found this show on the YouTubes, and
Hmm.
it's How Then Should We Live, or is it How Should We Then Live? I'm not sure where the
Yes.
then.
How should we then live? Yes. It's a little, it's like, where do you put the then?
Yeah, there's a then in there and a should in there.
Yes.
And And so it's a 10-part series, and I believe it's based on his book by the same name.
Hmm.
And it's pretty awesome. It's, I would say, um, from a perspective of a um, Protestant evangelical kind of Bible centric Christian perspective. And
Hmm.
it goes through all of history and basically how man has um, lived as a Christian and um how that's worked and not worked and what the challenges have been. And
Yes. Yes.
it's really neat because it's basically a history lesson. Like you could, we're homeschoolers, so like I could see letting my kids watch this in a few years and having it be like a history class. He lists so many philosophers, so
Hmm.
many important
Artists
figures
and
through
writers
history,
and
artists, painters, and different movements and things that were going on um, and how they affected the culture. And it's really good. Like it's really
yeah.
educational and it's done respectfully. Like he's not throwing anyone under the bus, but he's
Hmm.
kind of looking at you a little bit like this lifestyle didn't
Yeah.
do well for man. He's
He's got
like,
the head turn.
yeah, he tilts his head a little and
It's so
but it's
funny.
great. I've never seen that guy before. We have a few of his books on our shelf, but
I'm a lot more familiar with him. Yeah.
yes, yes. So I'm a newbie to him. I remember some people I knew liked him, but I just wasn't interested in that topic until recently. And he's just a really cool guy. Like he's super informed and
Hmm.
low key and he's
Well,
got the everyman.
and people should know he's mostly from the 60s and 70s, so he's
Yeah, this
not
is an
alive
old show.
anymore. He's from the 60s and 70s. His documentaries really show it. Like he's got that 70s vibe
Oh
in it
yeah.
mostly. But yeah, he's cute, he's funny, but he's very well informed. And also, here's a really great thing about Francis Schaeffer. This is a lot of the reason I follow him is because he has what I consider to be an accurate and a well curated view of culture. And he's one of those rare theologians that sees culture as very important. And so many of them do not. They just think of church life and how people should live in church, but they don't think of how they're living out in the world, and they don't think of uh, you know, it, um, it's almost like there's two men, and the one is the man you are at church, and the other is the man you are at your job and home, and that's all private, and it should be kept separate from what the pastor talks about. And this is a very atomized and segmented view of a human being. And so Francis Schaeffer is one of those rare theologians that's thought a great deal about the whole man, the whole culture, and how society is supposed to live, not just Christians, but how all of us are supposed to live. And so he thinks about the culture, he talks about the culture, he talks about how to engage with culture. It's very exciting. It's very refreshing compared to the modern kind of thinkers out there.
It is refreshing. Yeah. I had a mostly secular education, so like seeing God's perspective, like very intentionally seeing God's perspective throughout history
Yeah.
is pretty cool. And he's talking about a lot of artists that I've heard of that I enjoy and um, philosophies that I've heard of. And so just hearing, the contrast
Yeah.
has been really cool. And yes, I love this style. I love this style from the 70s. I will say aesthetically, it's a really fun show to
It is
watch.
fun.
He
Yeah.
talks directly to the camera. I literally feel like it's just him and the cameraman.
He inserts himself inside dramatizations, which is
Yes,
really, really funny and cute.
yes,
It's a little awkward, but it's like very charming. You'll have
yes.
these people acting out a scene behind him, and then he'll like
Hmm.
step into the foreground and be like, "This was Descartes when he was doing
Yeah,
this,"
it's
and
great.
you're like, "What? Wait, what?"
Yes. And
It's
there's
great.
lots
Yeah,
of like zooms, like the cameraman will
yes,
dramatically zoom in on something or
the
zoom out and then
70s
pan really
zoom.
fast. Really cool stuff. I'm a big fan of that style. And then he'll often have stuff with him. He'll be carrying like a whole bunch of books and he'll just like open the book and show you and like read it out loud or like just
Yeah,
lay
here's the
out.
Declaration of Independence. Here's
Yes.
the Constitution.
He'll take
Yeah.
like all these books and just start like laying them out on the table. Like these are all the important
Yes,
philosophers from the 17th century. And then
it's so great.
it's really
Yeah.
good. I recommend it. And we watch it on YouTube and we don't get any ads, but there might be some other place where you can find it. Maybe the
Well,
library.
then one of the th great things about him too is he's pulling out all these authentic documents and all these things.
Yeah.
And the great thing about him is that he's not just talking off the cuff, like we're going on YouTube off the cuff. He's researched all these matters a great deal. He's not like the typical person you see today who just makes claims and they don't have any evidence and they have never done any research. This guy is a scholar. He's an academic as much as he is involved in the culture and he cares about a great deal. So he's not going to just make a bunch of claims, higgledy piggledy. He's no, he cares a great deal about all the detail he's talking about. So
Yeah. And he's low key.
yeah, very low key, very fun.
Yeah, he's an
Um,
easygoing, low key kind of guy.
in fact, I was thinking I'm actually starting to take on a Francis Schaeffer look myself. I did not. That was not planned at all.
He's got a
He's got a
goatee.
little he's just more of a go-to, yeah. And then he's got the longer hair in the back like me a little bit.
Yep.
But
It's a good look.
he wears these funny outfits though, doesn't he?
I love it. He's so stylish.
Yeah.
He's got socks. He pulls the socks up to his knees
Yep.
and he just looks like he stepped out of, the 1700s
Hmm.
and then he wears these like turtlenecks with like a collarless. I don't know what that style is, but I'm a fan.
He doesn't have like the fluffy collar, but he could
Right.
if he want. I mean, if he wanted to, he
Yes.
could just put that on, and it would be
Yes.
totally like 1700s.
It's
But
like a
he'll have
nod
like a
to,
turtleneck on instead or something.
yeah,
It's really funny.
it's
He's
totally
good.
like a nod to historical fashion.
Yeah. So Francis Schaeffer is great because he's always to me had great theology. He runs the Labrie Institute, which is a bunch of like I don't want to say cottages, they're much larger, but they're these houses where you can go to and visit and ask honest questions around the world. They have a Labrie in a lot of they in the West, like I think they have two in the US, two or three, and then they have one in Canada. They have one in the UK, one in Switzerland. They started in Switzerland, one in the Netherlands. Like they have a variety around the world. So these are places you can go to just have honest conversations about God, basically, and ask honest questions. So
Yeah, it's pretty neat to
yeah,
have a ministry that is centered around conversation.
it is. It is. It's great. Yeah, and thought, like
Mhm.
what's the quality of your thinking about these subjects?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great offering, honey. Francis Schaeffer, and I'd recommend him. He also has this great movie, which I have not seen yet, by the way. It's kind of like How Shall We Then Live? How shall we see now I forgot. How shall we then now live? I don't know. Uh
How
now
now?
now how shall we then live? But he's got this one called Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and it's about abortion.
Yeah.
He was one of the only and few people that talked about abortion in the 70s and 80s. And so he's got a very good, at least for the time, it was very well informed and very educational, very helpful. It's still helpful today with the moral questions of abortion, but he, like I said, I haven't watched it, so I don't know, but I'm assuming that some of the technological scientific questions he might not be fully up to date, but I think he is very up to date on the moral questions. Because his quality of thinking is still very good today. So, and very, very relevant.
Yeah. What
But
about you? Have you been having any media experiences this week?
yes, quite a few. This is obviously the live stream won't show this, but this is Media Moses, where I write articles every week. And this week it was Jeremy Boring leaves as Daily Wire CEO. But why? So there's that. That's not really a media experience, but we can talk about that a little bit. And then more of a media experience was these other two, which is um, Cave Pictures Publishing's Phantastes graphic novel now stands alongside a growing catalog. Phantastes,
Fantasties.
yes, is a George MacDonald story. And this company called Cave Pictures Publishing put them out. I had learned about them from the producer of this short movie called The 21, which is about the Coptic Christian martyrs who were martyred in 2015. And it was really good. I'm about to do an article on that actually. I mostly finished it already, but I learned about Mandy Hart from there, and she also heads up Cave Pictures Publishing, and they do some great stuff there. This is their one of their latest ones that they did. Phantastes is if anybody knows about C.S. Lewis, Phantastes is the book that C.S. Lewis read before he was a Christian writer, and he describes George MacDonald's work, Phantastes, as baptizing his imagination. So he came before C.S. Lewis. He inspired C.S. Lewis, and he is, some people call him the grandfather of fairy tales, Christian fairy tales specifically. So he has incredibly imaginative and beautiful work. Um, and so they have other works as well at Cave Pictures Publishing. And some of them I will do another article on maybe. In the meantime, that crowdfund, which they did on Indiegogo, was successful, but they haven't delivered on all the comics yet. And supposedly they are just finishing up actually. So
Mm,
supposedly they're finishing up creating it and they're going to be sending them out soon. I don't know if that's a few weeks or like a few months, but we'll see. So I'm a contributor to it
that's
because I
exciting.
love George MacDonald. And we've talked ourselves, haven't we, about maybe participating in a George MacDonald
Yeah.
project of sorts, whether it's a comic or a film, or obviously a film is going to be a lot harder, or maybe even just making a reprint of a lot of George MacDonald's stuff and selling it on Amazon or something. Because we love his work, and
Yeah.
there's not always great like reprints of his work out there. So, um,
Yeah, we were just talking about this. We are like, somebody ought to make a graphic novel of Phantastes. And there it is.
and there's so many of his other works too that would be great. In fact, one of his best fairy tales, probably his most famous fairy tale, is called The Light Princess. And supposedly they have one at Cave Pictures. that they
Awesome.
and it's not even just one comic. It's like a comic book series, I believe.
Oh,
So I don't know how many it is, but supposedly they've already done that. I don't know if that was maybe some of their earlier work at Cave Pictures. I have to check that out still. So going to be doing research on that to see if maybe the live or the Light Princess is a good rendering. Here on the Zoom, there's my other article, which is about this chilling trailer for Live Not by Lies. It announces the Angel release. So Angel Studios is finally releasing Live Not by Lies. It's put out the trailer. I believe it came out yesterday or something. It's a pretty good trailer. I guess I might as well play it. But as I said, I call it a chilling trailer.
Warning, this historical program contains malinformation and wrongthink.
How did people fall under the spell of leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, and Mao? The short answer is the telling and believing of lies. And the solution to this mass delusion is precisely the opposite. The telling of the truth, no matter the cost.
Totalitarianism is a system of governance which seeks to control every aspect of your life. What you can know, what you can
Love
say,
him. He's great.
eventually what you can think.
You're outside here when you know you shouldn't.
We put someone on trial for praying inside their head.
Are you here to pray for the lives of unborn children?
If we got to that place
Do you
already
believe
in
that?
2020, where can we be in 10 years?
What we're seeing at the moment are tyrannical views that are emergent rather than controlled and distributed from the centre.
We're seeing books being cancelled, texts being changed. This is 1984. This is Brave New World.
If you eliminate or invalidate history, people lose direction.
Yeah.
And they will just do.
So, sorry to cut it off there, but yeah, I try not to show the entire trailer just to prevent getting copyright struck. But my goodness, isn't that, it's like, it looks like a really well-made documentary,
yeah.
and I'll definitely be watching it. Rod Dreher is great. I mean, he's the guy who wrote Live Not by Lies, and he did it as inspired by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived communism. So it's got a lot of great concepts. And just that simple concept that started out was, in an empire of lies, truth is very dangerous. So the idea is to live by truth and not by lies. And this all by itself is a revolutionary act in a communist country or in a Marxist thinking people. Like, so this also deals with a little bit with the subject I'm talking about today. But obviously that's brought to an extreme. Communism brings it to an extreme. But yeah, so I'll be seeing that. Pretty sure it says at the end of the trailer that it's coming April 1st to the streaming platform. So that's Live Not by Lies. I hope it's good.
Wow.
So our subject, since I was just talking about communism, our subject is about how the church, or why the church cannot create community and therefore cannot create culture. And so that's not meant to be an absolute statement. It's not meant to be an accusation or condemnation of the church in general. What it's meant to say is that the typical modern American church doesn't understand some basic concepts about how community and culture work. And therefore, they have difficulty understanding how to build culture, how to participate in building culture. And so their influence in society is greatly diminished. Now, we could say this is all on purpose or whatever. We could start, accusing or whatever, like that, like the trailer on communism. You could start looking around and say, oh, communists and Marxists and stuff like that. That's not helpful to do that, right? But the reason I'm tying this to Marxism and communism is because communism and many of these isms or ideologies do literally the opposite of what they claim to do. In other words, if they present a problem, then what they do is they claim to be able to solve that problem, and then they do almost the opposite of solving it. In other words, they worsen the problem and then continue to claim that they will fix the problem. And how can they do this except that they're very good at the marketing and the propaganda of what they do? So they're good at selling you the belief that they can solve the problem, right? Politician, propaganda, like mass communication specialists, right? The arts, culture, all of these things. Very good at this. And so why is this so important? Because they can get away with so many lies, right? If they do that. So if they fool people into believing all these lies and they just keep believing it, they can get away with what? Something that you would never believe that they would do, which is to actually cause the problem that they're claiming to solve. So, for example, communists got into power by killing tons of people in their community. Like they have a community, and Bolsheviks were a very small part of the population, right? And so when they came in power, then they claimed to be able to solve that problem. But what do they end up doing? Killing much of their own community. Does that make you think that they understand how community works? Like, clearly not, right? When you live in a community, you don't just force everyone to do what you want or you kill them. That's not how living in a community works. That's not actually how a community works at all. It's almost the opposite of how a community works in general. In other words, they have claimed to be the masters of community, and they claim that they care more about community than anything else. And then they betray that very claim when they get into power. And so they actually do not. And if you look at the Chinese Cultural Revolution as well, they were really good at this. Their people would be very good at accusing, especially the older generation, of things that they did not do, so they could condemn them and just throw them out and kill them. And so it was a lot of backbiting and infighting that they would do, right, in order to literally destroy the community from within, right? So the forward-thinking academics and elitists, those are the ones who win. But everybody else, the people in their community, they would destroy. So literally, it's the opposite of what they claim to be. So, and there's more about this than just community, right? It's not just community. It's lots of other concepts, right? So claims to be able to solve problems with like healthcare or welfare or things like this, Social Security. So many of these things literally do the opposite of what they claim. So public education, opposite of what they claim. What do they claim? There's going to be an educational level, right, that they're going to offer children. And this is going to be so much better than what they get otherwise. Literally the opposite is true. This is a lot of how these kinds of philosophies of Marxism works. Now, what we're talking about tonight, though, is the church and why the church has so much difficulty with this, with influencing culture. Well, because culture is influenced through, basically, culture is grown rather through influence in your community, right? So if you have more influence in your community, you could call them influencers. But like people in a community, if they are participating in that community in a fair way where people respect you, you gain influence in that community. And this community has to be a real community, though. There are situations where there's a lot of fake communities, right? And so that influence can appear to be authentic, but it's not. It's maybe bought influence, you know? And so you gain this platform, but you really don't have any followers or whatever, but you look really important. There are situations like that too. It's true. But culture itself is like a conversation. And that conversation is meant to be a back and forth. When someone is talking, but they're not listening to you, then it's not a back and forth. It's not really a conversation. And so if someone is forcing you to believe something, you don't really believe it. They're just forcing you to believe it, right? And so you could believe whatever you want, but what you're understanding is that this is not a two-way thing. So as culture is less and less voluntary and participatory and like a conversation, the more it's not authentic culture, right? Then you get a lot of subcultures, right? Under the supposed mainstream culture. And the more this happens, the more those subcultures actually become more powerful than that mainstream culture, because there's like a groundswell of these kinds of subcultures rising up. And eventually they could overtake that mainstream culture. And the reason is because they are vibrant cultures where people feel like they're able to participate and communicate. And they believe, because see, culture is really based on stories. And so back in the day, you would have literally like, you know, there's no like TV and technology and those stuff. They didn't even have, at a certain point, they didn't even have writing and books. So this was all done through oratory, right? Campfire stories. And that's essentially how your culture formed, is in these stories that would give explanations for how the universe works and how your tribe works and how society works and how nature works. And all these things are explained through storytelling, not just through like some rudimentary kind of science or kind of some kind of superstitious belief system, right? That superstition, if there is one, or any scientific knowledge, if there is one, comes through storytelling, comes through a narrative. Like right now, we have Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is more about storytelling than it is about science, right? Because there's this notion, this image of this primordial planet that's been forming over millions of years, and how the different life forms form, and how they go from the microscopic to like, multi-cell organisms, etc. That's all an imagery that's placed in your head through stories you're told in school, right? Growing up. All of that is a narrative. And you're told it through books, right? If it was through other things like data, you'd have kids out on a little at a stream, and you'd be collecting data and all this stuff. And then you'd be looking at it and talking about how Newton did this and how the apple fell on his head. And you'd be acting all that out, right? Because that's what evidence. That's not just storytelling and narratives out of books. So my point is that primarily culture teaches through storytelling. Why? It's far more efficient to just open a book and read it than it is to have every child act that out. And so that's true. It's far more efficient. It's powerful. If that story is then true, now you have a bunch of well-educated kids, right? And if that story, though, is not so true, now you have a bunch of misinformed kids who actually they were better off before, right? It's better to not even educate a child than it is to misinform them. So now what you could do is teach them how to think, and then give a lot of theories. And then if you do that, if they know how to think and they have lots of theories, then what can they do? They can hold two thoughts in their head and not have to be upset about it, and not have to be angry and be like, these people lied and these people are telling the truth. And now you don't have to, because you know how to think, right? You could go back and forth between theories and say, well, maybe this is true. And maybe if I get more data, this will be more true, right? So you can be more rational, more reasonable. And it's about knowledge more, because you're about gaining more knowledge so you can what? Finally decide what you think. But if you're told what to think, there's no decision on your part. but you give just proper answers on the test. That doesn't say what you really feel. It just says, oh, this is the correct answer. So I want to pass the test. So, right. So this is not really about what you really believe. And here's my point. That's what the church does today. Right? The church in the West has failed to understand that as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and all these things that are supposed to be based on facts and knowledge and good things, as it's developed, right, through the course of history, we started to turn from a body of people who talked about ideas and allowed two thoughts to be in our head and not get upset about that, instead get more information and talk and debate and discuss. Instead, what do? We say, this is the proper doctrine, right? And this is not. And so we just get the right answer to the test, right? To keep from getting in trouble with the teacher. In this case, the pastor or the people in charge of the church, the people who are teaching the class. So this is the issue with the Western church now, right? We have one guy at front and they're a teacher and they're giving you the proper answer to the test and you're supposed to learn it and then go, yes, sir. Yes, Father. And you're supposed to just obey. And you're not necessarily engaging with ideas. Really, you're not. What you're doing is accepting the answer to the test. And so what this leads to is inauthentic culture, right? Inauthentic culture is one in which you do not engage, one in which you're told what to think. That's called propaganda, by the way. You're told what to think, and then you just say, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, and you move on with your life instead of dealing with bad grades in school or dealing with someone who says you're not a good Christian, which can be far worse. I've had that happen to me. Oh, you're just not a good Christian, not a good person. So, this is very hurtful to people and very harmful. And of course it is. Because that's what they want, because they want you to stay in line. If you just accept the proper answer, then you will get the good grade and you can move on with your life, right? And just like in ancient Rome, just offer incense to Caesar and move on with your life. It's so much easier to just say, okay, Caesar's God, I can just move on with my life. That's what they want us to do. We're just going to move on and not have to deal with the nonsense, right? Of all these intolerant people, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the problem. A true church cannot do that. If you're the true church, you're willing to literally suffer and die for your faith. And that's an authentic faith that struggles with questions, that struggles with difficulty. When I say struggle, I don't mean you argue and get mad and complain and bicker and moan. No, I mean, you're honest. You honestly want to know the truth. Mm-hmm. And so you discuss. Imagine if you were in a science class and you were like, I honestly want to know the truth, teacher. Do you think that they're going to like that? No, they're not going to like that. You did not just accept the dogma. They don't like that because the teacher has to spend longer on you now. The teacher is already overwhelmed with work. They don't want to know that you're a young earth creationist. They don't want to know that. They're going to spend their time making fun of you in front of the class, right? They're going to love doing that now, because otherwise they have to be really upset about it and annoyed. They don't want to do that. So you see what I mean? The monoculture of Western society has become like the old Roman system, right? Where you have to just give the correct answer, move on. You could be of any religion you want. The Romans didn't mind what religion you were from, as long as your religion was polygamous. right? As long as you were not a Christian who would only worship Christ, the triune God, right? And so as long as you also worship Caesar, you're okay. And so what do we have now? We have a lot of people giving doctrine in church and in school and at work, maybe, right? You're supposed to have this kind of belief system. If you don't, there's a problem with you, right? Maybe you have to sign the dotted line and do a contract, to work somewhere. And maybe you're not allowed to share your faith at work, etc. There are lots of things that our society frowns upon. And if you break those rules, these are like breaking some sometimes unwritten social rules. Sometimes it's very written, right? They don't want you to do that. So there's a reason I didn't, by the way, didn't get a degree in college. Rebecca knows all about this. But the reason is because I was in my Christian high school, I actually was encouraged to talk about these things and be honest. Right? I didn't always win in my debates in high school, and I didn't have a lot of them, but I was encouraged to honestly ask questions and honestly do research. And if I found things in that research that made me think differently than the teacher, I could bring that up. And I don't think I would be hated for that at all. But when I got to college, not only did it feel like 2 grade levels down from my Christian high school, but you were not encouraged whatsoever to have a debate or bring up an inconsistency in the class in order to understand the subject better. And the more you did that, the more the teacher would dock you in some way in your grade. And one of the things I had trouble with in college was they would say I could do such and such, and then I did it, and then they were like, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean you should do that. You can't write about whatever you want in your composition class, but you said I could. No, I didn't. I meant anything but that. Anything but religious stuff. I don't want to hear about that. So, these kinds of things would continue happening to me. But so that's just one example. One of the things you see as a result of this inauthenticity in church is that, first of all, it makes it easy for sin to thrive in a church. Why is that? Because if you're not encouraged to discuss and talk openly about honest questions, how do you think someone who's a sinner is going to feel about sharing honest frailties and difficulties, right? Mm-hmm. Expose themselves to their pastor or somebody if they know they're not going to be accepted for doctrinal differences. That's just a doctrinal difference. That's not something embarrassing like some sin. So if they're not going to be accepted for doctrinal differences, they're not going to be engaging in any kind of confession to their pastor or to their priest, right? And so this creates a perfect environment for sin and for muck to thrive in a church, is that it's inauthentic. And so you can't really be authentic. You can't really share your true self. You have to share kind of your fake Pharisaical self in front of people in church because they're not going to accept you for who you really are. So, and for me, by the way, as a Christian artist, this becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly because I don't have a lot of doctrinal differences with people. Not that would be horrible, but I just don't tend to, because I've done enough research to be very confident in my doctrine. But what I try to do is have relationships and talk with people about the things I care about most, which is creative endeavors, creative ideas, how to affect the culture, how to make a difference in the world. And as an artist, I think of creative ways to do that. And so I've already got plenty of years doing this. So I'm pretty confident in my ideas, right, as an artist. And I also know a lot of people are not artists. So they don't think creatively. And there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has the thing that they're good at, right? I admire people who think differently, and I would think that they would admire me for thinking differently. But why is it that that's not the case all the time? So, because I think differently, and because what I do is talk about culture and the arts, I find that a lot of fellow Christians frown upon that. And I don't know if it's because they're afraid that socially I'll embarrass them by doing something strange and artsy and weird. And, you know, a lot of people look at artists and they're like, oh, that guy's kind of weird. We don't mind. We know we're weird. Like that's just not a problem. That's not the real problem, right? You can call me weird all you want. The problem is when people disagree about the way you want to make art and affect the culture as an artist, even as an artist, when they're not an artist. And so it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right, for me to go to a plumber and tell him how to do his work when I'm not a plumber. And art isn't just about thinking and quality of thinking and doctrine. And art is not about doctrine at all, by the way. Art is more of like plumbing. Art is a craft. And you build that craft through more experience with the art form. It just so happens that art can be a very intellectual craft. And so you can do a lot intellectually and thinking wise in the art form, but that's part of your craft, right? It's like an engineer or a mathematician. There's a lot of thinking involved, and the quality of your mathematical thinking helps you in the craft and the practice of mathematics. So as you do it more, the more you can think in very quickly about that craft, about what you do, you know. And so obviously, if you're a plumber and I'm coming to you and telling you how to do your plumbing, you might laugh, right? And maybe even feel insulted. And you know what? You probably should, because it's not too smart on my part to do that. Well, the same is true for people who talk to artists, right? But I find that it's very common, I feel, for people to talk to me in a way that's like, where they feel almost offended that I would suggest something creative as a solution. And a lot of the reason I think this is because Hollywood has a reputation. And so that reputation is not great. But the problem is I have the same problem with Hollywood. So I'm not going to disagree with you on that. I'm not Hollywood, right? So in fact, I probably criticize Hollywood more than non-artists would. So there is a guilty by association problem there. I think where people think, oh, if you're an artist, you hang around with other artists that are bad people, and therefore you must be guilty by association. And that's a very ungenerous take. There are those people too, though, if you're not going to look at it in a ungenerous way socially, right? You can look at it ungenerously in an intellectual way and say, well, maybe this person is too open-minded, right? Now, sure, if I wasn't very knowledgeable about Christianity, I could understand you being like, well, if he's good with arts, that means he's probably not good with his doctrine or his theology. Probably hasn't done a lot of study on this. And so this bad theology and doctrine, by the way, this is all an assumption, but this bad theology and doctrine is probably entering into their art form, and this art form is being spread to other people. It's almost like he's spreading evil, terrible, bad ideas. Okay, you can look at that theory, but then you have to test that to the reality and say, is my theology bad? And the answer is no. So, um, so they have to, you have to try better. It's not the intellectual problem or the doctrinal problem, and it's not a social problem. I think that it's frankly, I don't think people are very well informed about how culture is made in the church. And so as a result, I think they feel inadequate, unconfident around artists. And so when artists come around and have their ideas and talk about what they want to do, it's intimidating, right? And possibly annoying because it's also weird, right? Artists are weird. So maybe they're weirded out by it. That's fine. Let us be weird. We're just going to be weird. But the fact is, if you support us, we can affect the culture. Now, let me get to my larger point here. And because I'm titling this, Why the Church Can't Build Community and Therefore Culture, right? So I've talked about why the church can't build community in a way. Are there, by the way, honey, I wanted to ask you also if you know of or if you can think of other ways that churches fail to build community.
Yeah, like I mean, one of the main things that churches tend to do is they will have small groups and they will have outreaches, things like that. I love the idea of churches being more intentional with a person's life. Someone's sick and they all rally around that person,
Right.
um, and help them. You know,
That's great.
that's an awesome thing that happens
Yeah.
often when ladies, when you just have a new baby in the family, you'll find a lot of the church ladies will make a meal train and everyone will bring them food. So
Invaluable.
yeah, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. I don't know if that's exactly what you were thinking of. Um,
Those often are very successful ministries.
yeah, yeah, and that helps you to just make connections with people, doing things together, charity type things together is a great way to spend time. Um, yeah.
Obviously, as a lady, you're going to think of the ministries that women do,
Yeah.
cares, gifts, things like this. Obviously, men can do some of these things, not a lot of them, but not some of them, but a lot of them. By the way, speaking of men, I'm not familiar with a lot of ministries specifically for men. Obviously, they exist, but I think in comparison to the amount of ministries for women, it just dwarfs. I mean, women's
Yeah.
ministries just dwarf men's ministries.
Yeah.
And that's on that's there. It's no wonder because women go to church more than men
Yeah.
do. But is it
And
a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like,
right.
well, men aren't going because they're not being catered to,
Right.
um, and men aren't being catered to because they're not going. So,
Yeah.
um, so I think a real effort, obviously, if churches want to bring men back into the church, they have to make an effort to go out on a limb and do something that not a lot of people are going to attend at first, right? Because they don't have the people in the church
Yeah.
to attend it. So you'd have to really do an outreach to men. Um, and
Well,
so I hear a lot of people talking about this, but they rarely succeed.
yeah. And I would say outreach is a good word
Yeah,
because
sure.
um it feels like a lot of times you're given this kind of broad um task to invite your friends to church, invite your family and friends to church. And then this idea that, well, then everything will just kind of fall into place and everything will work out.
Mhm.
Um, but you use this word outreach. What about just like honing in on some people and being really real and vulnerable with them, being available to talk to them, doing something for them,
Mhm.
even just taking them for coffee, like just, I mean, that sounds like again another one of those sort of easy things you can do, but like,
Yeah.
what if we took it
These days, it's not
farther?
easy. These days,
Yeah,
that's not easy. Yeah.
yeah, that's true. But like, what if we took it farther? Um, you know, having people over for dinner, like this is a good first step, but just being a real friend,
Yeah.
um, is one way that you can create community. Just deciding that you want to be a real friend to someone instead of just kind of, hey, come to church, get involved, because it's very easy to get lost in church,
It's
in a
so easy.
community.
Yeah.
You
It's
know
so
people
easy to get
by their
lost.
first name, maybe you might forget their name. If you've seen them maybe once a month at church, if it's a big
Yeah.
church. Um, yeah, I would say hone in on some people, ask the Lord to curate some friendships for you and just give, right? Just
Yeah.
give, give a Christ-like friendship.
Yeah. And every church is going to be different. So there's going to be different kinds of groups based on the interests of those members. But you can't get more basic than just inviting someone to a meal. Everybody eats.
Yeah,
That's what communion is essentially, is just having a meal with somebody. I think
yeah,
that's kind of what it should be, really. I think that sometimes we really I don't know if you'd call it minimize communion, but I think the wafer and the little tiny little grape juice cup kind of minimizes communion. I think that's a problem in the church, in the Western church. I, it's one of the things, by the way, I appreciated about the Greek Orthodox is that they don't tend to minimize these things. Now, they might have a little wafer or whatever, but of course that they treat the Eucharist like the Eucharist. So they don't minimize it in other ways, right? But what I'm talking about is as a Protestant, not minimizing it as it comes to the essential understanding of what a meal is and what a community is. And so communion is not just something you do just because you're told to do it. Communion is supposed to be an experience that you have with a body. And it's more than just let me eat this bread and wine, drink this wine with you, right? Um, First of all, I do believe in the true presence, but second of all, I think that what that means is you're communing with God together. It's not just you and God, it's you and God and the church around you. How are you going to commune with the church around you if it's just you and the somebody in front of you and you're just taking it and moving on? You just missed the point. You need to have a meal together with people and eat with people and talk with people, like literally talk during communion. That's what communion is, in
mhm.
my view.
Yeah, that's thick. The love feasts that are mentioned in the New Testament and Acts. That
Yeah, a
was,
lot of churches stopped doing that.
yeah,
I believe that there's this, I don't remember when it happened, but the churches stopped doing it because people were imbibing too much in alcohol. And no kidding. So they stopped doing it. They stopped making that the regular thing. But more recently, I think some denominations have started doing the love feast again. I think it's brilliant. I think it
yeah,
needs to happen again. People know when someone is doing that, like when they're abusing the cup, right? They need to educate and say, you're abusing the cup. That's just not acceptable. So, when there's this more broad understanding of how to do communion and how to do the love feast, then I think that you're going to be a lot more successful. But I think that that's part of the point I'm talking about, though, is if you want to really have community, you have to have a more authentic communion.
Yeah.
And then you also want to not just have meetings with the church together, where the pastor or the priest is giving the sermon, and then you're moving on. No, you need to meet people one on one, and you need to have talks, and you need to be authentic, because what you were describing before is an authentic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard so many pastors and preachers and people who work at churches, oh, I want to have an authentic relationship with people. And then they don't do it. They talk about it, but then they don't do it because they don't even know what it is. Right. So, these things are not easy. Like, you have authenticity takes energy. It's difficult. It's purposefully done. And, there's lots of ways you could fail at that. So you have to be raw and open with people. And if you can't do that, then you're not doing, that's just not authentic. Right. So without these authentic relationships, your church is not going to experience community. And what is my major point here is this is why we're not engaging in the culture. Because engaging in the culture is even more difficult than doing that with people that you already agree with them on so many things. Right? Culture is not somewhere where you're going to agree with everybody on everything. That's absurd. Culture is some place where artists beat their heart against walls, like Pink Floyd's The Wall, right? It's not forgiving to do that. It's difficult to do that. And you're just there to give your 2 cents sometimes and move on. And then have a conversation about how it's terrible that you made this art. And everyone's going to tell you how terrible it is. Okay, fine. Move on, make another piece of art. Right. So it's, you know, most people, when they work at their jobs, everybody's not going to come down on them and tear them apart every 5 minutes for it. That's just not happening to you. So this is what people who engage in the culture have to deal with. They deal with this constant complaining and bickering and moaning and interpreting of their work in all different ways, right? So this is not easy. This is why people who engage in culture need communities. If they don't have communities, how are they going to survive engaging in the culture every week? They're just not going to survive. They're going to get torn down by the culture itself. And then the people who are supposed to improve the culture are going to then become influenced by the culture, right? And all their messaging, all the goodness and the good art that they've got to offer that culture is going to become old and dead. It's not going to be useful anymore. So they have to go home, or they have to go to a church where they have real community, and that church community builds them up again after they get defeated and torn down and destroyed. And then they build it up and say, it's okay. I'm proud of you that you did that. Go out and do it again, right? This is what we're not getting. We're not getting that kind of support. Instead, they go to church and they get torn down there. So those people are not going to survive. And really what's going to happen is that they will survive by succumbing to the culture who supports them and understands their needs, because they deal with the same thing. They are also engaging in the culture. Now, don't you think that they're going to understand that person? Of course they are. And they're going to be very sympathetic, and they're going to just say, well, all you have to do is get rid of your good doctrine and your good Christianity and your good conservatism and all the good morals. And then we'll be your friend and we'll take care of you. That's very tempting, I assure you. So the true families and the true communities are the people who are supposed to protect these souls from those hardships. And then they become that person, that artist on the front line becomes the voice of that community. Those voices of your community need to be good voices. And if they're not good voices, then the messaging you're sending out in the community is not effective. It's not useful. It's not helpful. And it might even make your church community look bad. So you need to really work on helping and supporting the artists in your church by actually having real communities, right? Because it's not just about your artists, right? You have lots of other people in your church community, but you got to be authentic with it. You got to be real with it. There should be something like real communion with real food, right? And there should be something like authenticity where people are able to confess sin and not be condemned for it, right? And not be hated and not be blah, 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 right? So approach these things with scripture and the kindness of our Lord. And I think that you'll have a better community. And then as you have a better community, eventually from that, as artists are accepted and brought into the church, then they can have an influence in the larger culture, right? And you know, and you're confident in them that their message is going to be good message. And you want to support them in all their weird artsiness because that's going to make the craft side of their art more effective. They're going to be a better artist, right? If you let them explore that more, they'll be a better artist, right? I mean, like I use the example of a plumber a lot, but it's like, imagine if you had a plumber, but you were like, oh no, don't do anything new, Mr. Plumber. I don't want you to try any new technology. I don't want you to try any things that the other professionals over there do. Just do the most basic rudimentary plumbing you've been doing for 100 years. That's what we want from you. Nothing new. Stop playing around with new ideas. No, plumbers need to learn new stuff too. Right? There could be new technology, lots of other things they could use. And then true, they use new technology and it doesn't work out. Well, guess what? That's how they get better at it. And then this is not rocket science, people. They gotta practice it before they get good at it, right? So you have to let them practice it. You gotta let artists practice, play with new ideas, and then give it a few years, and they're gonna have a great film or a great piece of art or what have you after that. So, I mean, musicians in the church should be doing this. Musicians in the church, they should be making art albums together, creative albums. Isn't that what Johann Sebastian Bach was doing in his church? Why aren't we doing that stuff? That would be awesome. So it's just that the creativity is not being encouraged and they're not being given incentives to do that. So allow culture builders to be part of your community, build a real authentic community. And now the church has something to say in the world. And this is why it's not happening. Very simple. So any thoughts, honey?
Plumbers.
We love those plumbers. That's right. Everyone needs a plumber. That's my point, right? Yeah, like everyone's going to need a plumber at some point. Everyone's going to need an electrician at some point, maybe. Um, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say just be real, just be available to give, because there's a reason God has you where he has you and you have something to offer
Yeah.
people that are around you.
And you're absolutely right. We all have something to offer somebody. And if you're authentic and real, I was going to say there, I could have talked about Daily Wire a little bit tonight. But Media Moses and what I do here, we don't speculate on people and engage in clickbait and hateful content of people that we do not know, and where we throw people under buses and for clicks. That's just the most skeevy, scummy thing people do online these days. I think it's just like it's very clearly stated in the Bible to not judge people that way. And so we follow the Bible.
Yeah.
That's what we do here. So we don't know what's going on with the Daily Wire or Jeremy Boring. We love what they do. My hope is that Jeremy Boring is finding his place and will be able to make creative content even better than he did before, whether that's the Pendragon Cycle or other movies, and wish the best for him and for the Daily Wire because they are some of the few conservative media platforms out there that exist. And they're making a difference. So appreciate them. We are not happy if someone like this has trouble and fails. The way so many people in the world are, they want other people to fail. So we're not fans of that stuff. So that's kind of malicious, I think. It's not very nice to do that stuff.
Yeah, I
Did
mean
your
it.
mommy treat you right?
Yeah,
Did your mommy teach you correct stuff? Come
yeah.
on.
Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth.
There you go. Thank you, sweetie.
We don't want bad things happening to people.
No,
That's
of
not
course not.
that's not fun.
Of course not. Not fun for anybody. And we're definitely not going to try to make money on that. Ugh, what an ugly attitude that would be. So, love you guys. If there's any, is there any other thoughts you had about this subject?
I really liked what you were saying. You made me think of something when you were talking about one guy preaching a sermon. And
Yes, yes.
I just think it would be so awesome if churches were more about not just one guy. Like if you had
Mm-hmm.
multiple people, and I don't think you need to be a pastor, um, but to just have people in your community
Mm-hmm.
just just do a teaching or a
Yeah,
sermon or something. And it's not the same person every time.
right.
And obviously, you feel free to have conversations
Mm-hmm.
and ask questions and be like, well, I don't know about that, or God didn't show me that, or like you have the freedom to talk it out. I just feel like that in itself would inspire a lot more community.
Absolutely. Because that totally plays into the point I was making about authenticity, right?
Yeah.
When you're able, as a teacher, as a leader, to say, well, I studied this, but I did study this other subject, and that's really interesting. And so, like they can learn something from just anybody says
Yeah.
if they're willing to listen. And obviously, if they're not willing to listen, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So you could be an expert on something, but then if someone tells you something you don't know about, it really reveals who you are when you don't deal with that very well. Like, yeah, but
Yeah.
I'm a doctor of this and that. So and then you act like you know everything. It's just absurd to act that way. Like, no, we know you know some things about this subject. That doesn't mean you know everything about everything. It's silly,
Yeah.
but this kind of ego, like that, see, and the Bible tells us this very clearly as well, is we shouldn't respect people more, set them in high seats of authority, you know. And when we treat people like this, it's not good for us to do that. So it's better for us to treat others as better than ourselves and to realize that truth can come from almost anywhere, you know. And so you're always ready and willing to learn it. Um, But like what you were just saying about you don't necessarily have to be a pastor. For a second there, I was like, oh, I don't know about that. But then, you're right about that as it comes to not in a traditional sense. Like I think traditionally you want to follow these things, but the current age is such that I don't trust necessarily a pastor just because they come from a seminary. Because so many of our seminaries seem just like, oh, like really? You believe that?
Yeah.
Are you serious? That
Yeah.
sounds more political than religious, or that sounds like good with theology, but not good with praxis. And that sounds good with this, but not good with the historicity. That's not, you know what I mean? Like so many seminaries
Yeah.
seem to be not so good as maybe they used to be 100 years ago. So it's like, I don't necessarily think just because someone's called a pastor that this makes them even good with their doctrine these days. Some pastors just don't even seem good with their doctrine. So if someone really has just a heart for teaching and loves the Lord and really works at study and holds themselves accountable, right? As it comes to like how what their attitude they're exhibiting to others. And they might have the heart of a pastor, right? Um, but not be a pastor. These people I might trust more than some pastors. So, but I think, like you're saying, this really has to do with the authenticity factor.
Hmm.
More than anything, you don't have to be a pastor or a teacher to teach something and to be a good leader of a small group and to, like we've talked about the feminization, for example, of the church. And obviously, as you know, I believe that men are the head of the household because it's clearly written in scripture and they're the leadership of the church. But let's not be absurd to think that women can't lead a small group somewhere in the church. That's not what they're talking about. What they're talking about is kind of like authority, right? So that authority has to do with the fact that they are responsible for that church and the doctrine that's taught in that church. And so when there's questions of doctrine, there's questions of this or questions of that, or there's some difficult subject that has to do more with the fundamentals of the faith, right? Like, is
Yeah.
Christ God, for example? Is the triune God real? Like so many fundamental doctrinal questions. There are people who are men who are in charge of being the ones who are responsible for that doctrine in that church. And so these are the ones that you defer to. I could be a man, could be a woman. We do things, and then we have a question about something, and we go to them and we say, well, what do you think about this? They are more of an authority on these
Yeah.
things. And so those are people you should be able to trust with that. Um, and but what we're really talking about is more like the layman, how the laymen treat people and then are the people in charge facilitating that happening or are they just getting in the way, right? So like a lot of pastors, they can be great on doctrine, but they're not good with community. They don't answer the phone and talk to you. You know what I mean? Like they're not they're not they're skilled in some ways but not in others. You know, pastors need, I think, need to be helping facilitate and making sure that there's a real community growing, but they're not the only ones doing it, right? They're not the only ones leading small groups and making sure these things are happening the correct way. Um, so there's a hierarchical, you know, group that, a tree of hierarchy that starts just like a family has a hierarchy, a church has to have a hierarchy, and then mutual respect can happen, right? So respect has to do with your purpose and acknowledging that this person has a unique purpose and so you respect them for that purpose, right? You give them proper respect for that purpose. And so you know, all of us has a place. And when we're seen as having that place, kind of that office, so to speak, then that's respect, right? And so then women, for example, can then understand what it means to respect their husbands. It's not some kind of weird emotional thing as much as it is understanding the office, right, that your husband holds and then respecting him for that office.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not as touchy-feely, right? So we don't need this to be an emotional act whatsoever. This is an acknowledgement,
Mm-hmm.
a recognition that says, like grandfathers have the same thing. Your grandfather, he's not strong anymore, he's not vivacious anymore, but you respect him for your grandfather. You respect his position, his place, right? And so when he's talking, you listen and you don't speak harshly to him. Things like this, right? So you're respecting his proper place in the family as a fixture in the family. Um, if you're having Thanksgiving dinner and someone's about to pray and he prays, everyone listens and lets him pray, right? So this is a respect for him in his place. And everybody needs respect.
Yeah.
Everybody needs love and respect. But sometimes there's an emphasis, right? And so, like a church, and this also plays into the community aspect of church. Because we need a full community, there's going to be a diversity of different kinds of people. And all those people need their own respect, right? And so as we're loving our neighbor and as we're loving our church, people are able to see, oh, well, you respect this person, but you don't respect that person. You know what I mean? So all of us have things to work through. And the beauty of a church is that you get an opportunity to work through your own difficulties by connecting in that community. And then what? You're going to hit a wall or something's going to be difficult. And you're like, well, I respect them, but why don't I respect them? This is not something that you just do and you don't even think about, right? No, there's got to be an effort made. And that's acknowledging the fact all of us need to look out for ourselves, treat other people with respect, and go, oh, well, there's something I'm working through here, right? And so if there is an acknowledgement made in that church and in that community, hey, we're working on how to respect each other properly. This is a great thing, right? This is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
So these acknowledgements really need to be happening, that this is what we're working on, this is what we care about. And like I said, this leads to you influencing the culture, right? Now you have good artists, and they're not just good with their craft because you encourage them for being weird, first of all. But second of all, you encourage them to understand doctrine better. You encourage them to be well-read on mythology, on art, on history, on things like this, so that their art is better, right? And so this is how you can influence the culture.
Yeah.
All right. So any other thoughts before we wrap up?
No more thoughts.
All right. So where can people find you, Rebecca?
Oh, you can find me at Rebecca Loves Jesus on YouTube, and you can find me at Rebecca Croft at Substack.
All
And where can
right.
people find you, John?
You can find my writing on Media Moses, of course, and you can find me at X on at John Edward Croft and at the Media Moses. Of course, I'm here on YouTube at Cultural Warfare with Jon Croft, and that's pretty much it. So in the meantime, stand up for the culture. All right, guys. Good night, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Good night.